Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's conversation about a constitution of knowledge. I'm Mary Clark, Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor here at the University of Denver, and I'm so pleased to join with my interlocutors and yourselves in a conversation this afternoon about freedom of expression, especially as it relates to higher ed and as experienced on college and university campuses. I will begin with a series of questions after I introduce my fellow conversationalists, and then I will look forward to turning to your questions. I believe you were provided note cards on the way into the auditorium, and there are also 4 stations here in the auditorium on which you can write questions that I will look forward to at the end of the hour. But first, some introductions. Dr. Jeremy Haefner, seated most closely to me, is the 19th Chancellor of the University of Denver. He will be officially inaugurated tomorrow morning. He previously served as Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor of the University of Denver. And prior to that, Chancellor Haepner served as Provost at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And before that, as a professor of mathematics, as the Dean of Engineering and Applied Science, as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, and the Dean of Graduate Studies, all at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Jonathan Rauch, seated furthest from me, is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, and the author of 8 books and many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and the recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, which is the equivalent to the Pulitzer Prize in that particular industry. His latest book, published in 2021 by the Brookings Press, is entitled A Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, and that is the book about which we speak today. It has been described as a spirited, deep-diving account of how to push back against disinformation, canceling, and other new threats to our fact-based epistemic order. In other words, how we know and learn about the world. In 2018, he published The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. I could jokingly say that I'm looking forward to learning about that, but I would not be truth-telling apropos of this afternoon's talk. Okay, some of you understood. Other books include Denial, My 25 Years Without a Soul, a memoir of his struggle with his sexuality, and Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America. His most recent ebook is Political Realism, How Hacks, Machines, Big Money, and Backroom Deals Can Strengthen American Democracy. Although much of his writing and his public engagements have been on matters of public policy, Jonathan has also written on topics as widely varied as adultery, agriculture, economics, gay marriage, height discrimination, biological rhythms, number inflation, and animal rights. And we will hear about all of them today.
No, we won't.
That's your challenge. You'll have to intermingle them all. We are very fortunate to have you here with us today, so thank you, Jonathan.
I could not be more honored to be here.
Well, thank you. And the first question is to you, and that is, what is the Constitution of Knowledge?
So I'm glad you asked. I should also say what a pleasure it is and an honor to be back at DU now for my 4th visit, and a shout out to my friend and mentor, Rick Caldwell, who first brought me here in, I think, 2000. Every society, small or large, needs some mechanism for coming to some kind of agreement, at least for public purposes, on what reality is like. They don't have to agree on everything, but a lot of people think Elvis Presley is alive and living apparently in Indiana. Do we send him a Social Security check? The answer is no, and there's a reason for that. So the historic way humanity has done this is you would have a set doctrine which would be enforced, and a prince or a priest or an oracle or a politburo would decide what truth is, and if you dissented from that, you were driven out or killed, and then the societies would split. You get schism, you get warfare, you get ignorance, violence, and oppression, and that's the first 200,000 years. About 300 years ago, some people come along and say, let's do it differently. let's use rules instead of rulers. And they set up what I call the Constitution of Knowledge, which really is a Constitution of Knowledge. It's not just a metaphor. It's not a simile. It's doing in the epistemic realm, the world of knowledge, something very much like what the US Constitution is doing in the world of politics. It's saying, okay, there's going to be conflict. Let's set up norms and institutions that force people to channel this in ways that can be socially constructive. So the US Constitution pits ambition against ambition. The Constitution of Knowledge pits bias against bias. The US Constitution distributes power so that it's very hard for any one faction to dominate. Constitution of Knowledge distributes idea-making power so that you have to persuade others. One works on compromise, one works with persuasion. One has representative government, the other relies on professionals and experts, as well as public input. And the Constitution of Knowledge turns out to be the first and only known system that can actually turn conflict about ideas into the productive output of objective knowledge, which is what you're doing here.
So Chancellor Haepner, I'd love to hear why this resonated so strongly with you. And indeed, I understand this was beach reading for you in Hawaii.
Yes, I have my original copy here, and if you open it up carefully, sand will actually come out of it.
That happened to me last night.
Yes, it did. And it's well underlined, I will say. So I thoroughly enjoyed your book, Jonathan, and it's absolutely a delight to have you here. We had a wonderful conversation last night, and I know we're going to have a great conversation today. So what resonated deeply with me on the Constitution of Knowledge, I think the best way to understand my appreciation of that is to think about how the lenses that I come to the table with. So I'm a mathematician, I'm a scholar, and I'm an educator. And as a mathematician, in the scientific world, mathematics is built on axioms and a lot of rules from which the logic flows, and we discern truths or theorems using those axioms to prove the results that we are looking for. So it deeply resonates with me in that community-based sort of sense. As a scholar, the notion that we would submit our papers, our theories, our work, our research, our results to the scientific community to be peer-reviewed, to undergo the test of validity by the scientific community, the mathematical community in my case, deeply resonates with the decentralized model that you talk about in the Constitution of Knowledge. And then as an educator, the notion of where we are today with truth and misinformation concerns me greatly. So this idea that here is an acknowledgement of a framework of how we discern truth, and oh, by the way, it's been with us for 300 years, is timely for me, because I, as my role as chancellor, take very seriously what we are doing to support our students in terms of the competencies and skills that they need once they leave the University of Denver. And this notion of truth has to be deeply embedded in what they take away with us. So it's for those reasons why it's spot on.
So Jonathan, following up on that, in your book you write about a reality-based community or a reality-based culture. What do you mean by that, and why is that important?
Well, to continue the parallels, with the United States Constitution, we talk about it defining a polity, which is a community of people who may not always agree on the outcome or like the outcome, but do agree on the rules. And the same is true in the Constitution of Knowledge. It's mostly a professional community of people who are following some pretty elaborate rules and structures for making knowledge. Like you can't just use ad hominem attacks, you have to adduce evidence, you have to be able to persuade anyone, replicability, peer review, all of this stuff. So who are the people who do versions of this, whose job in life is to try to seek objective knowledge? There are 4 pillars of the reality-based community, all defined by adherence to the Constitution of Knowledge. The first and most important is this university writ large, the world of academia, scholarship, research. And that's the long pole in the tent. If that pole collapses, the whole enterprise goes down. And that's what you two are doing for a living, and that's what the provost of this university's job is to defend every day. The second big pillar is journalism, writ large again, the world I come in. This is the world of fact-based journalism, not the crazy stuff, but the people who do the fact-checking, who are accountable to editors, who have to run corrections if they're wrong. The third is law. Super important. The word fact originates, the concept of a fact originates not in science, it predates modern science, it comes from the law. You're a lawyer, and as you know, you can't really have court proceedings without some common account of facts, and in fact, fact-finding is something the law does. If you don't believe that, ask Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Donald Trump. And the fourth big part of the community is the government, which is it has to be fact-based. Otherwise, it's completely arbitrary and capricious and can do all kinds of crazy stuff. So everything from the scientists at the EPA to the FBI, the CIA, the Weather Service, administrative law, all has to be fact-based and fact-driven. So those taken together, plus some other offshoots in the consulting business, museums, libraries, those are the reality-based community. But what I want to stress is that you here in this room and in this campus are at the core of this enterprise.
I will say that when I first got to that section in your book on reality-based community, it did give me pause, because I often think of reality as how people perceive the world around them. But as I got to understand your argument about that the knowledge is eventually accepted into the community after significant validation tests, right? It passes the test of time, that it wasn't an individual's perception of reality that I was thinking of, it's the community's perception of reality. And for that reason, I got a lot more comfortable with reality-based community on that one. So.
Yeah, that's important and helpful to remember that what we're talking about and the enterprise that you're all involved in here is creating objective knowledge. And that's a set of propositions that have been validated, time-tested well enough and satisfactorily enough to enough different people and enough different arguments so that they can go into textbooks and fill the libraries. And that is something created by this kind of gigantic universal hive mind of individuals and institutions around the world, multiple languages, multiple backgrounds, plugging in to this giant matrix-like network of looking for each other's mistakes, which is what you all are doing here. The result of that is a set of propositions which are independent of ourselves. Human race could die off, and in 1,000 years, aliens could come to our planet and reconstitute our databases and read our books and put all of that knowledge to work, just like that. Mm-hmm. That's objective knowledge, and that's what it is that we're producing here.
Mm-hmm.
So Jonathan, I'm going to pivot slightly. You've shared with me, and I think you've shared more publicly, your membership in the gay community, and you've shared with me that you believe that speech and freedom of expression has been very important to the gay rights movement, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I love to talk about it because, to be honest, Mary, of all the things that I write about, nothing breaks my heart more than to see members of many minority communities, especially on university campuses, turn against the freedom to dissent. I am now married to my husband, Michael. He's here today. We've been married now since 2010. I grew up in a world where same-sex marriage was literally inconceivable. My father told me, don't even go there. Don't advocate same-sex marriage. You'll just make yourself a focus of ridicule. In the world I was born in, people like me, and I knew this as a child growing up, we could not work for the government. We were a stench in God's nostrils, according to preachers. We were deemed mentally ill by the psychiatric profession. We were denounced and reviled as anathema everywhere. What do people think changed that? I mean, do they think somehow it was money or street campaigns? It was free speech. It was our ability to make our case as given to us in 1958 in a Supreme Court decision, which none of you have ever heard of, called 1 v. Olison, which stopped the government from censoring a non-pornographic gay magazine, which is what the government had been doing. That gave us our voice, and people like Frank Kameny and many others stepped forward, and it was a struggle, but we used our voices to show that we were not sick, we were not dangerous. The reason people hated us is they thought we were sick and dangerous and going to undermine the country and seduce their children, and if people think that, they're going to hate us. We showed them it's not true. We used our voices to do that. Same as the women's rights movement. Same as the African American civil rights movement. Same now as the transgender rights movement. This is the ability to dissent and make our case when we are at our most unpopular. This is the core of the advancement of social justice. And it just breaks my heart to see some people say, well, no, it's conservative cover for capitalism and oppression. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm sorry, I rant a bit on this topic.
It's good.
I love that. I'm gonna take the conversation in a very related way, but again, more at the university level. Yesterday we had a absolutely delightful conversation with Secretary Condoleezza Rice and Secretary Madeleine Albright. And one of the most poignant takeaways I had came from Secretary Rice, because she is a faculty member at the Stanford University. She's also director of the Hoover Institute.
And former provost.
And former provost. But what I took away is she was very declarative. She says she does not want her students to be comfortable. That's not how they're going to grow. That's not how they're going to learn the skills that they need to navigate some of these really difficult issues that are painful for some of them. So given what you just said about your travails as a gay man, I mean, you must have been confronted with quite a bit of vitriolous hate kind of speech in the process. How did you navigate that? Because this is an issue today of how do we make sure that we have these opportunities for everyone to express their point of view.
So I rarely, if ever, hit out-and-out hate speech. You know, faggot die, that kind of thing. Once at a debate I was doing, we were told we'd be picketed by the Westboro Baptist Church, the God Hates Fags church, but they didn't show up. I didn't face that, but what we did face all the time was the much more politely phrased bad idea. You know, for example, homosexuality is a disease that's treatable with therapy. And all kinds of stuff like that was ignorant and wrong and actually hurtful to young gay people. And the answer to that was that to try to silence those people would be like trying to fight global climate change by breaking all the thermometers. You need to know where these bad ideas are, and then you need to be able to confront them and show that they're wrong. And that's what we did in a calm and systematic way. We dismantled them. And in fact, the hateful stuff, the really antagonistic, nasty stuff helped us, because it allowed us to prevent the contrast that they were talking about hate and ignorance. We were talking about love and truth. Was it dangerous? I don't think it was physically dangerous. Was it emotionally hard? Yeah, I can tell you that you know, begging for the right to get married, you know, oh, please, Mr. Straight Person, can't I get married too, just like you? Won't you let me do that? There is an element of humiliation about that, but something else that breaks my heart is the notion that you often hear that members of minority communities are fragile. You know, that if we're confronted with bad ideas or bigots that will just melt, you know, will run to mommy in the form of the, you know, campus HR department. This is so patronizing and so wrong. We are strong. If you're biased against me, don't report it to the bias incident team, report it to me and I'll set you straight. So one other thing I'd say is that people say, well, it's such a burden to have to educate people. And I say, it's a burden, but it's also an incredible privilege. Minorities are at the forefront. We are the vanguard of progressive social change down through history. And yeah, that gives us the burden of having to make this case and educate people. But I wouldn't trade that for $1 million, because we have changed America for the better. using our voices. So I think there's a mission here, not just a burden.
Wow, that's powerful and inspiring.
I was just going to play on the same theme in terms of the mission of higher ed. And Chancellor Haepner, why are you so interested in civil discourse? What is it that you would like to see our students here at DU take away from their time on campus?
You know, this is why this book is so thought-provoking and really helpful to me. And again, I go back to the role that, you and I share as educators. And because we're provost and chancellor, a heightened sense of that for our students. The world is a complicated space, and it has become, of course, in our society and actually across the world, very polarized, very divisive. And there is an argument to be made about whether technology has exacerbated that division and that polarization. Be that as it may, whether it is true or not, and I personally believe it has, how do we combat that? How do we give the tools and skills to these students so that, first of all, they embrace free expression. They embrace the ability of someone else to express their viewpoints. How do we make sure that they are equipped? And these, I'm borrowing ideas from your book, Jonathan, on this. How are we equipping them with the skill set to do their own fact checking? Because that's the reality we're living in. It is almost incumbent that every statement has to be fact checked these days. So are we giving them that skill and the reasons for why they have to do that? And then the third is, are we giving them enough opportunities to have those experiences where they are pushed and challenged in these kinds of conversations, so they learn these skills of listening across differences and this finer art of persuasion. For me, it's just absolutely critical that we do this, especially at a great university like the University of Denver, which has produced tremendous graduates in the past, and we're producing them now. But are we doing everything we can for their lives of purpose that we want them to have?
And for their identities as citizens, for civic engagement beyond the walls of our campus. So Jonathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we best prepare our students to engage in civil discourse across difference, including intellectual difference.
Well, intellectual difference is the big one. I'm all for diversity of background and ethnicity and all those other categories, but knowledge comes from diversity of viewpoint. This is, Madison said, U.S. Constitution, how do you make a democracy stable? How do you avoid factions taking over? He said, enlarge the sphere. He said, a larger democracy with more factions and more different viewpoints will give you better results in terms of the outcome, because you'll have more inputs from different points of view, and it'll do a better job of keeping the peace, because you'll have more people in that room and it's harder for anyone to take over. The exact same is true in science and in a university. If everyone in the room is agreeing on the basic premises, then good science is not being done. Because the voice in the room that would ask the hard questions and say, wait a minute, is your assumption really right? Isn't there. One of the things that worries me most about academic life today is that there are disciplines now and departments on campuses across the country where the consensus is so overwhelmingly politically and ideologically progressive that a student can pretty much negotiate their whole professional life in academia, undergraduate, graduate school, dissertation, and then their academic career without really having to encounter an ideological viewpoint that's far different from theirs. That creates bubbles, it creates distortions in the science, it's costing public trust, and this is getting to the point you both were making, it's unfair to the students. Because it is not showing students that there are multiple ways to look at hard questions like affirmative action, gender differences, the police brutality, all of crime, all of these issues. If you try to shield ourselves from that, then we shortchange the students and we shortchange science. So one place I would begin is by elevating viewpoint diversity to full equality as a campus priority with other forms of diversity. It is now increasingly well established. More and more studies are finding that active discrimination in hiring and promotion and grantsmanship and so forth against people who are not progressives is rampant. And I think universities need to take that problem seriously and take it on and make themselves welcoming, not hostile, welcoming to heterodox points of view. It's a wonderful group called Heterodox Academy, group of professors doing exactly that. So that's a good place to start. Another thing is very simple. In a world of colliding ideas, where that's where knowledge comes from, we talk as if words come at us like bullets. We can't help but be offended, but that's not true. I know enough Japanese so that right now, if I chose, I could call you both the worst thing in Japanese, and you would not be upset or hurt. There's an interpretive element, and something that the receiver can do is if you confront someone who says something you think is objectionable, wrong-headed, bigoted, whatever, you have a choice. You can dial that up to outrage and turn it into a campus campaign to drive this person from the community. You can dial it down to annoyance and say, gee, well, that's kind of a dumb person, or maybe I should talk to them, or maybe I should just avoid them. But just move around it. If you do the latter, you leave a lot more room for the kind of debate and diversity that we need on campus and in life. And we have that choice.
I think there's no question that how you deliver your point of view or how you react to a point of view is really important. And I think at the universities, I think we've struggled with helping people do that dialing down. One word we use is respect here at the University of Denver. Civility, of course, is another one. It's all in the spirit of acknowledging one another's humanity and getting to the point of this free discourse of ideas. Also in your book, you not only mention the lack of diversity from our students' point of view, you also had a number of stories where faculty in their own research and their own scholarship have been curtailed, that the disciplines that are out there, some of them are really limiting the freedom of thought of research, which I think is also equally disturbing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's a new phrase that's floating up called suppression of scholarship. You both heard this phrase? And that's a label for what happens when various social mechanisms and investigative mechanisms are used to suppress points of view. I'm so glad you raised the point of civility, and Mr. Chancellor, I know tomorrow civility will be one of 3 big initiatives that you're going to announce. And it's important how you say these things. I've usually found when I was confronting even people who are very hardline against gay people and gay marriage, I usually found that it was a mistake to define the whole person by that one disagreement. That there were other things other places where we could begin and build a way to talk and work our way toward at least an honest disagreement. And I always found that to be worthwhile. And I always found if we did that and the other side didn't, we won. So I view that kind of civility as part and parcel of social justice. And that's why I'm very glad that you're emphasizing it tomorrow. It isn't just what we say, it is how we say, and it's also respect for facts. Factuality keeps us grounded in things other than ourselves. So just because you believe something is true to your own experience or is a social narrative that makes important lessons, that doesn't make it true. You've got to be accountable to facts and hold the other person accountable to facts as well. And once you start doing that, you begin to have a locus where you can begin to actually have a debate.
And as you know, in our conversations last night, at this point in time, I have approximately 22 hours before I deliver my inaugural address, and so it's plenty of time to work on version number 19, which I'm I'm at version 18 right now, so I want to get to version 19 just for the number's sake. But your suggestions, your ideas are extraordinarily helpful. And as we talked right before coming out here, nudge us, push us. And you are, and I thank you for that.
So I'm going to nudge you both. Are there limits to free speech on campus? Are there situations that you would acknowledge free speech principles give way to other values or principles?
Well, let me answer that and also maybe take the opportunity that I've been given to nudge a leader of one of our great educational institutions by citing two documents, both of them very good, but somewhat different. So, University of Denver has a free speech policy. And I read it this morning, and it's a good free speech policy. And one of the things it says is, yes, there are limits to free expression, but they pretty well overlap with the accepted limits to free expression that the courts allow under the First Amendment. And those are things like, well, there's securities fraud, doesn't concern us, but there are things like direct targeted harassment, true threats, incitement, and it has to be real incitement to real violence right now. Those are not protected under the First Amendment. And that means that if, for example, Jeremy Haefner follows me around campus all day yelling, faggot, 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 he can't do that. By the way, if he follows me around all day on campus yelling, genius, 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 he can't do that either because that's both harassment. It's content neutral to a very, very large extent. And one of the things that I think the DU outline gets right is that if it's not protected by the First Amendment, DU doesn't need to protect it, though it can. But if it is protected by the First Amendment, in the outside world, then DU should honor that spirit in the same way. And that means people will hear things they don't like. No, friends, hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. Most people think it's not. It is protected. That said, if I get the opportunity to nudge the chancellor, which I think I've been given, I would urge him to upgrade the DU policy. I would like to see you go to the Chicago Statement of Principles. And the reason for that is some subtle but important differences which go, I think, to the core of the university mission. The DU statement says, I'm paraphrasing inaccurately, but basically it says, free speech, absolutely, but must be weighed against inclusion and welcoming environment. Chicago says free speech, welcoming environment is important, but can never be used to limit speech or debate. They block that door. They set clear priorities. The second difference is that University of Denver says, of course, you can have counter speech from individuals. And the university is also free to express its own view of expression on campus. Well, it does have that right, but that's usually a bad idea because it's very tempting then for universities in their official capacities to join campaigns of denunciation, which is devastating to a faculty member, having the people who hire and fire at the top say, we condemn what this person says. The University of Chicago closes that door, and they say individuals can and should counter offensive speech. But that is up to individuals, not the university. So to me, that's the gold standard policy, and that does increase civility. It does allow some conflicts to occur, but it's forcing those conflicts down into the community. It's saying the university is not going to take its whole might and main and try to resolve these things for you. It's going to treat you as grown-ups in a community, and you'll need to work things out. And in the, I think, medium and long run, that is better for civility. So I would hope you'd consider that kind of commitment.
You were telling us earlier that the example of another university out east that didn't follow the Chicago principles there. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and involving a University of Chicago professor. So we're going to be gracious and not name names.
Correct.
It's all in the, you can Google it out there, so you know, have at it. So a professor I think I can name the university he came from. At University of Chicago, it was controversial for a political statement he made about, I think it was DEI standards backfiring, something like that. And he's, I believe, an exoplanetary biologist, and the great institution back east invited him to give a prestigious scientific lecture. And then several hundred people and a number of departments on campus said that because of his controversial political statements, he should not be welcome at the university, and the university disinvited him. The Academic Freedom Alliance, another important new group, which I would recommend people look at, has written a strong letter condemning that as a clear violation of academic freedom. I mean, think about this. A scientific lecture was canceled because of someone's completely extraneous political views. If that's not suppression of scholarship, I don't know what would be. And of course, you're being inaugurated into a role where you're going to confront this. Mm-hmm. People are going to say, this person, Rauch says bad stuff, and you're giving him a platform. That shouldn't happen. And it would be great to have commitments from you and the university and to have them in writing that if it's you're going to protect these values. You're going to protect scholarship. So I'd love to see that. I'd love to know what you actually do in that situation.
Well, so academic freedom is really fundamentally important to me, and I know it is to our provost as well. There was an incident, this is years ago at the University of Colorado, and it was undergoing some very difficult times. This is right after 9/11, and a faculty member there wrote a very controversial paper that really accused that 9/11 was a result of politics of the government, our own government. And of course, as you can kind of imagine, that controversy did not play well with the rest of the state of Colorado. And there were calls for his termination. So academic freedom was clearly on the blocks there. And what I admired about this, and it's not well known, is that the university rejected the calls to terminate him on the basis of the content that he had, and went through a very lengthy process of a peer-reviewed process with the faculty that ultimately said, no, he was exercising academic freedom. However, then they began to dig in how he had done his research and found that there were problems with the integrity of the research. And that led to a different process that ultimately had him separated from the university. But nonetheless, I took away from that a strong commitment and understanding of the importance of academic freedom and, frankly, the importance of the tenure system that we have here. So to answer your question, I would find what that Eastern University had done is completely abhorrent and against the principles of what we really need to stand for at a university, and bring him to campus so that he could.
I'm so glad to hear that, and I hope you'll pursue that when it gets hot, because it will. And I'll tell you another story that you haven't heard because it came out better, and we don't necessarily hear the stories that come out okay. I'll name the institution because I think they handled it ultimately the right way. The philosophy department, this happened just I think last week or the week before, philosophy department at Rhodes College in Memphis invited the philosopher Peter Singer to speak. I think it was Zoom. And Singer's very controversial. He says things in his philosophy and runs thought experiments that a lot of people find deeply abhorrent. Argues that the lives of children and babies are not as valuable as the lives of grown-ups. Things like that, right? And a bunch of departments and a bunch of people started campaigns saying this guy is genocidal against the disabled and we should not host him. And the philosophy department, to its credit, refused to back down. And they hosted him, and it went through. And they did not, in the end, have to involve the administration. But situations like that are very fraught when you're in the middle of it, and you just want it to go away because there's so much heat. The trustees are calling you saying, what's going on? Why are you hosting this nonsense? So I thank you for that commitment, and I'll hold you to it. I'll come back here.
I know you will.
So are there any limits to the Chicago principles? Are there any that you would identify?
I think the First Amendment principles are pretty darn good, actually. The second principle is important. It's not just, so I think I'm going to make the same point you're making tomorrow, so I'm stealing your speech. Sorry. There are three principles that organize life in the constitutional knowledge. The first is freedom of speech, but it's only one of three, and it's only the starting point. Freedom of speech gets you conversation, but knowledge requires a lot more structure and activity and self-discipline and error-seeking and peer review and all that. So the second pillar is discipline of fact. So if you have a biologist who's speaking about his field and said something unpopular about politics, no problem. If you have a biologist who is giving a lecture and saying creationism is just as good as Darwinism, that's violating the rule of factuality. And that's professional incompetence and goes back to what you said earlier. But that's no longer a free speech issue. That's a professional competence issue. No one's going to stop him from being a creationist online or whatever else he wants to be. You're just saying you're not going to teach that as biology. And then the third is diversity of viewpoint, and we discussed that. Nothing else works if you don't have healthy arguments, healthy conversations. And those three together. And so if you've got speech that's being used in a way on campus to shut down viewpoint diversity, to silence people, if there are people in this hall right now not letting us make these arguments and not letting others in the hall hear these arguments, that's also unacceptable. That's a violation of academic freedom. So those are the limits that I would cite. I don't know, what would you?
Well, okay, so I want to put a pin in those three pillars, but I will, answer this question. And it really is you and I in our deep conversations about this topic, which has been extraordinarily helpful to me. And as we've talked about it, we do deeply appreciate the fact that at a university, at a residential university in particular, where our students live and learn 24/7, it is very difficult for them to escape a dialogue or a discussion that they may find egregiously hurtful or hate, that they're sort of captive here. And does that in and of itself mean that we should think of the freedom of expression, the free speech rules differently because of the consistency of which they are barraged perhaps by that? Now, I will say, that may or may not be the reality, but it is a possibility that we have to think of. And I don't think you and I have come with any wonderful solutions around whether that or not. And the dialogue with Jonathan, of course, has also helped me think differently about even that aspect of it. So the answer is not clear, but it's one of ongoing conversations. I do want to come back to those three pillars because you've given good nudges around freedom of speech, thinking about the University of Chicago principles is going farther. You've given us some resources, the Academic Freedom Alliance around diversity of thought, intellectual diversity.
Yeah. Heterodox Academy, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and others, yeah.
So the one I want to ask you is on the discipline of fact, right? Are there resources or are there principles out there like there is from the University of Chicago for free speech? Are there principles for this truth-seeking that you talk about in your book, this discipline of fact?
Oh, there are tons of them. But they vary by profession. This is where professional standards are so important. Remember, I alluded earlier to the fact that the U.S. Constitution is designed by Madison is deliberately not a direct democracy. The people participate, but most of the work is done by professionals, representatives who are delegated. The same is true in the sciences and in the humanities, as well as in journalism and law and government. You've got people in all the disciplines. You've got places like the American Geological Society, the American Astronomical Society, the American Economic Association, the Royal Society, the first and still greatest. Isaac Newton founded that one, the American Society of News Editors, now called the News Leaders Association. So people often don't realize this, but the formative element in creating modern science as we know it and differentiating it from the kind of folk conversations of the past was establishing professional standards and saying, so here are the things we expect of you if you're in this discipline. Doctors can't just sell snake oil because they think it works. They're going to have to look at the results of controlled experiments. And here's how those work, and here's where they're going to be published, and you can get fired if you're a doctor and don't do that or lose your credentials. Same thing in law, right? American Bar Association, all the things you have to do. So each profession, when it's functioning well, has these institutional safeguards that not only impose some discipline, including a discipline of fact, but they actually shape who we are. And those are, you ask what you want people to leave this institution with. One of them should be, even for the student who's not planning to be a professional academic, enough acquaintance with the professional standards of the reality-based community, how hard it is to make knowledge, how you do have to try to stick to facts even when you wish they were otherwise, how you do have to frame arguments in ways that other people can understand and respond to. Enough acquaintance with that so that they will feel comfortable and friendly to the constitution of knowledge. Seeking knowledge is a professional business for the most part. I mean, I can't even understand what a physicist says, literally. It's all math.
Yay.
I could never understand any paper you've written. So you don't want, America can never be entirely devoted to seeking the constitution of knowledge. It's just not what most of what we do is, but it can and must be friendly to the constitution of knowledge. The people coming out of here have to understand these principles and be welcoming to them. Unfortunately, the rest of my book is the many ways that's being undermined. It's another conversation maybe, but.
And that's very, very fascinating, but thank you, because I think that really helps me think about the discipline of fact and how, what can we do across the university to ensure that our students have an understanding of that role. And then in each discipline, because everyone has a major, is it reasonable to ask the faculty to say, okay, describe your professional standards to our students so that they have a deep understanding? I'm not sure we do that today, but it would be worthwhile. It would be very worthwhile.
I was going to say, you both set up the first audience member's question, and they're all written in the same handwriting, so I don't know if all the questions came from the same person. But the question has to do with the professional standards of journalists, and how might we reform the professionalism among journalists, those involved in the media, in order to elevate our national discourse, whether it's around domestic policy or foreign policy or otherwise.
Well, that's a great question and close to home, because I've said some critical things about academia. Journalism has some problems, too, including its own problems with lack of viewpoint diversity in newsrooms. So journalism is under a lot of economic pressure right now. And one unfortunate consequence of that is that it's a lot cheaper to produce opinion than news. Much cheaper. And producing news requires often whole investigative teams, FOIA requests, months of hard work to dig this stuff out. Super, super important, very, very expensive. The economic model is collapsing, and that means we're seeing the substitution of quick hit opinion journalism, which is also very sticky online, so it becomes profitable. So I don't know how to solve the economic problem, but I can tell you that mainstream journalism is increasingly aware of the problems that are being caused by, for example, journalists popping off on Twitter. That diminishes our credibility. I think most editors actually wish they had never gone down the road of asking journalists to tweet, which they did 10, 15 years ago. And we need to do a better job of separating fact from opinion. Even with constrained resources, we need to do a better job of making sure multiple viewpoints are heard in the editorial process. I mean, completely taken surprise by Trump's victory. I mean, all you had to do is go and look at yard signs in Pennsylvania to know something really big was cooking out there. So yeah, there's a ton we could do. That said, I think the foundational elements of the ethics of journalism, mainstream journalism, are sound. They were set out in the early 20th century by the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Until then, American journalism was just a cesspool of extreme hyperpartisanship and fake news. And it was out of control, and the audiences increasingly were hating it, and it was unsustainable, just like social media now. And the decisive turning point was the creation of these standards, the creation of journalism schools that began to professionalize the field so that people began understanding expectations, the establishment of awards like the Pulitzer National Magazine Award, which created incentives to do the right thing, and the migration of audiences toward this new model, creating a business model for it. So can we replicate something like that today? Can we go back to those standards and uphold them and find an economic model for them? That's the question. And Mary, I wish I could tell you it's an easy problem.
There's a role that the truth-friendly people in the public could play to help support our journalists, right? To really subscribe to those media outlets that do embrace real, authentic journalism in that sense, because the financial model is of course under great stress, and it's if we continue to not support really great journalism, we will ultimately lose it, and that will be disastrous for our democracy.
It worries me sick. Local news coverage is collapsing, which means public officials are not being held accountable, and the public doesn't know what's going on in many cases. And that's a dangerous situation.
Chancellor, your comment just now anticipated the next question, which is, you'll appreciate this, how does the 4D student experience help empower our alumni to understand better, to filter through misinformation, disinformation? How can we here on campus produce the types of graduates who will then vote with their feet, so to speak, in terms of professionalism among journalists and other media actors?
So for the benefit of everyone understanding what the four-dimensional experience is, this is a university-wide initiative to really intentionally provide some structure to our aspiration, which is to teach to the whole student. Not just teach for a particular discipline, but to the whole student. And it emphasizes 4 different dimensions, and the very first one is at our core. It's our bread and butter, which is advancing the intellectual growth of our students. It's done in the classes and in the programs and in the wonderful interactions between faculty and students that we have and enjoy at the University of Denver. The second one is preparing our students for careers of fulfillment and lives of purpose. And of course, this means things as rudimentary as, resume writing and interviewing and so forth. But I think on a broader scale, it also refers to the integrity of what they bring to their careers and to their lives as well. The third one is promoting well-being, and that is not just a physical wellness, but indeed a strong emphasis on the social wellness, how students or individuals interact with each other, and emotional wellness, how they interact with themselves or knowing themselves really in a deep and meaningful way. Even spiritual component is a piece of that well-being. And then the final one is one that is deeply important to me, and that is the exploration of character. Because I think in this environment, and this discussion is a great manifestation of that, character matters. How we conduct ourselves, what are our values, what are the virtues that we want to live our lives by? Is our behavior aligned with those values and those virtues that we have? How do students, what I like to ask sometimes is 2 questions. Number one is, what are the values that they remember their family telling them, when they were growing up? And then the other one is, what attributes do you want to be remembered by? in your life of celebration. And this is really important. I think this is where the university can really stretch its legs and serve our societies in deep and meaningful ways. Civil discourse is at the heart of this character exploration from my perspective, but I also think it plays a role in all four dimensions. It really does, especially in the intellectual advancement of our students, especially in their career preparations, because they will run into these issues in these times when they are confronted with great difference. And did we equip them with the skills? I think the four-dimensional experience is one I'm really quite excited about at really making sure that we're doing right by our students when they graduate.
So we've spoken of standards for journalists. We've spoken of standards broadly for academics. The next audience question is about standards for our public officials and political actors in terms of what they post on social media. Are there standards? Should there be standards?
Well,
how does that interface with your ideas about freedom of expression?
Well, that's a big, important topic and pretty much the second half of my book. There's a narrow way to interpret that question in a broader way. The narrow way, which I think is the intended way, is something like, should Donald Trump or other politicians who traffic in outright disinformation be allowed on social media? And I think in general the answer is it's better to disamplify them than to ban them, but it's a very difficult question because social media are private communities and they feel like traditional media, at some point they have some obligation toward truth. What we learned in 19th century American journalism is it became hostile to truth. If you're going to open your paper and read stuff that was just false and defamatory and harmful, that you lose your audience. So Twitter and Facebook don't want that. So that's a hard dilemma. I think a lot of that's going to revolve around hard questions about how they design their platforms and how they set their policies. Facebook has a super interesting thing going on right now. It doesn't get enough credit or interest. It's called the Oversight Board. Modeled a little bit on the US Supreme Court. You're nodding your head, so I'm guessing you've looked at this
I'm
as a lawyer.
familiar with it, yes.
So they've set up an independent panel of worldwide scholars, different countries, different perspectives, to try to begin creating some transparent, grounded standards for conduct on Facebook. And cynics say, well, that'll never work, they'll never keep up with it. Well, the cynics might be right, but on the other hand, this did work 100 years ago. Gradually creating some standards and having people opt into them and finding that the environment is better and then more picking them up and then evolving them, this worked, right? This, by the way, also worked in turning medicine into a profession and law into a profession and so forth. So I think a lot of the answer will depend on figuring out what are the social institutions and rules that can apply in the world of digital media to make it a more hospitable place to truth. We don't know the answer yet, but we do know that a lot of very smart people are working really hard on it, and that was not even true 5 years ago when their attitude was, what me worry, it's just a platform, anyone can say anything. The larger question is the question about politicians just lying. We've always seen some of that, but in the 2016 campaign, according to PolitiFact, of the checked statements, of which there were many, that Hillary Clinton made, 25% were mostly or entirely false. That's way too high, but that's what politicians do. 75% of what she said was mostly or entirely true. With Donald Trump, the equivalent number was 70%, 70%. What he said was mostly or entirely false. Then he lied about the weather during his inauguration, the number of people there. He lied more than 20 times a day. That accelerated with the Stop the Steal campaign. What we saw here was something new in American politics, which is the adaptation of Russian-style mass disinformation tactics to US politics. We have never seen that. We're completely unprepared for it. It is not primarily because of social media. They're also using the bully pulpit, conservative media. They're even using the courts of law to spread these lies. So that is not just a social media phenomenon. It is frightening. It has convinced 60 to 70% of Republicans falsely that the election was stolen. And that's going to be a very big problem.
So now I'm going to ask a question that may be a concluding question, allow you to pull back a little and frame. And the question is, are there particular ideas, Chancellor Haefner, that you've taken away from Jonathan's writing that will inform your chancellorship moving forward?
Well, the short answer is, well, stay tuned for my inauguration speech, I suppose. This is the easy way I can do that. But all kidding aside, as I've said, civil discourse is an incredibly important topic for me right now. More so than, I think, the ordinary citizen, because of the role that you and I play as leaders at our university and the obligation we feel about really making sure that we're equipping our students with the best possible skills for success and these lives of purpose. This will be a new initiative that I'm asking the campus to take on. And I'm open to dialogue on the topic. But I think just like Jonathan has nudged me, and maybe a little bit to you, I think we have to nudge our campus to take a moment, step back and say, are we at this point in time where we feel 100% confident that we're equipping our students with the experiences they need to have learned what competencies they have to succeed in that? And maybe I'll be refreshingly educated and say, wow, we really are doing a phenomenal job. But I think that discussion, it has to be had. It has to be open, and we have to welcome disagreement around it in a significant way so that we can be assured that, yes, we are, or no, we're not, and here's what we can do about it. I think some of those specific ideas that Jonathan threw out are going to give me moments of reflection between now and 10 o'clock tomorrow.
And maybe afterwards too?
And certainly afterwards as well, about what we can do to nudge the university forward on this really, really important topic. I mean, there's other things I'm going to say during my inauguration speech that will also be big nudges, not in civil discourse, but ones that I think will push us to be our very best. And that's, I think, the best we can do, is to push us to be our very best.
And it surely should be our aspiration for higher ed, if not here, where, is what I always say, which is why I'm in this business. Jonathan.
If I could, a good way for me to leave a parting thought is one of the things I've learned in the 28 years that I've been writing and thinking about this subject. My first book on it was 1993, Kindly Inquisitors, is the decisive and indispensable role of leadership in creating the climate on a university. The kind of leadership we saw from President Zimmer at Chicago made all the difference when Professor Abbott was hit with a cancel campaign. The president of that university had made very clear that he was not going to punish or investigate any member of the faculty for exercising free speech that was not a violation of professional obligations. When that cancel campaign hit, he issued a brief statement that said, Professor was using his free speech rights. We support that at Chicago. There's nothing here to investigate. And guess what? The counselors went away in search of softer targets. On the other hand, in a university where the top leadership is doing a lot of balancing, being very worried about putting out public relation fires, where people all the way down the chain are not sure if they're accused of racism, sexism, homophobia, whatever it may be, he's not sure that the administration will support them. They will dive under the furniture. They will become chilled. They will not take risks. I have heard this again and again from faculty as recently, not here, but as recently as last week. If they don't think that the administration has their backs and will defend academic freedom when push comes to shove, they become frightened and they will hide, and they will not do their best teaching, and their students will not do their best learning. So, to put a fine point on it, the key person on this campus is you. For the next 5 or 10 years, or however long you stay, and you have it within your power to set a tone and create some norms that can be transformative if you choose to do it.
Well, if that isn't a push and a nudge, I don't know what is.
The gauntlet has been thrown.
But I will simply say, first of all, a very gracious thank you for coming here and having this conversation. It is so needed and deeply, deeply appreciated. But your own lived experiences lend such credibility to what you're saying. And I think that's powerful for all of us to hear. And I appreciate that aspect of what you do in your book and what you do right now for us. You've set a high bar for me, and I like high bars.
We know he'll live up to it, right? No problem. I'm just so honored to be here. For all of you out there, the book is available. I'm happy to sign it. The book is better than the movie. But I'm so honored to be here and to be included in this conversation. Great.
Well, thank you to my interlocutors, and thank you to you, the audience, for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation. More to come. So thank you.